Welcome to Sex Therapists Shoot the Shit, brought to you by the University of Pleasure. I am Dr. Tera Jansen, licensed psychologist and certified sex therapist.
And I'm Laura Rademacher, licensed marriage and family therapist and certified sex therapist.
Hi, Laura.
Hi, Tera. We're back again with an exciting guest.
We got someone to come talk to us.
Someone came to see us. And he's someone who's come to talk to us before.
But he was so lovely, we wanted him to come back again.
That's absolutely right.
I'm excited. Do you want to
Always.
Should we reveal? We should go away and then come back.
We should go away and do some music, and then we'll come back and do a big reveal.
Good plan.
Okay.
Good plan.
All right.
Bye.
Good.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the music. The very brief music. Laura, I'm going to let you do the big reveal here.
Today we have Calvin Hauer.
Yeah.
Or as many people on Instagram will say, Calvin Hauer Power Hour, which is my handle. And it is becoming notorious amongst many people locally in Minneapolis. Whenever people are like, my friend Calvin, it's followed up with, oh, you mean Calvin Hauer Power Hour? And then I'll talk about it later. So here we are. Hi, everybody. My name's Calvin, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm not a certified sex therapist, but I do claim sex therapy as my specialty.
Yeah, and I don't know if people care or not, but there's different things with sex therapy. You can be a sex therapist, and then there's like a different certification you can go and get. So Calvin, you've been doing sex therapy for a long time now.
Absolutely. I come from the world of sex education and then transitioned that into sex therapy. So it's always been my specialty. I've had plenty of supervision from sex therapists around my work, and I now teach a sex therapy class at St. Mary's University.
I think we had you do this on the previous one we had you on, but I want to do it again because I don't know how deep we got into it. When we have people come on, do origin stories and hear a little bit about what brought them into sex therapy. Because obviously it's becoming a more, I think, popular field, but up until very recently, it was not as popular of a field. And so I think it's always super fun to hear how people got into it. So do you mind sharing your origin story with us, Calvin?
Absolutely. My first Marvel movie, if you will.
Yes.
We're not going to do the DC model where we're just shoving them all together into one movie. We're going to do separate movies.
I like that.
I just saw Deadpool and Wolverine, which is probably not the title, but I don't know what the title is. And it is? Hey, I got it. And I was thinking of you the whole time. So just had to let you know.
I'm so happy my brand is strong.
That's right.
Looking over at my Wolverine helmet that I have in my office. I have a very eclectic office that also has arcade cabinets and various other knickknacks. So, okay, so my origin story. So I am how do I say this? My grandparents had my mom when they were teenagers. And they're like, that was difficult. That made life hard. So we're not going to talk about sex, and we're going to kind of hold on to this idea that if we don't talk about sex or give any sex education, our kid won't go have sex and get pregnant like we did. So in 1989, that was proven wrong. And my mom had me when she was 17. My mom, looking at the transgenerational transference of trauma, was like, I'm going to do it the other way. And so I grew up in a very sex positive household with my mom. My dad's side, not as much. That's complicated. Families are complicated. But my mom.
We could just do a whole episode called Families Are Complicated.
Families are complicated.
That's another podcast.
Just that's true.
For real.
Are complicated. So I grew up in a relatively sex positive household, and I came of age during the George Bush Jr. era of abstinence only education. I grew up in a small town and then transferred to living in the city. And during that time change, like I started having more questions about sex and sexuality. I just like wasn't really getting much in the way of sex ed from school. A lot of my friends had a lot of questions that weren't being answered. And I decided to start buying books around sex and sexuality. It was intriguing to me. And also, I just like, I have many questions and no one will answer these questions. So I started buying books. I went to a performing arts high school. So that's the kind of place where you can just read sex books during study hall and nobody really bats an eye. During that, I started having more and more of my friends coming to me asking for advice around issues around sex and sexuality. And so at the time, I was like, I don't really want to go into performing arts. What I went in for wasn't really calling to me anymore, but this whole like helping people regarding their sexuality was like kind of cool. So decided I wanted to be a sex therapist. And then that started this like chain reaction of telling people I wanted to be a sex therapist at the age of 17 and everyone rolling their eyes at me and being like, sure you do, buddy. And then
Oh, no. I can picture that, but that must have been really discouraging at 17.
It's one of those things where like I like can't really be too mad at the reactions because I could totally see it, right? Like I was this little punk kid that was like, I want to be a sex therapist. It's like, okay. But as I went on and had to have more meetings to like, career counseling at various universities, declaring majors, like every time I had to take those steps, I was always asked, what do you want to be? And I kept saying, I want to be a sex therapist. And kept kind of running into people being like, I don't know how you do that. I don't know what you have to do that. Beyond saying, well, you probably have to take some psychology courses. So I did that. And it wasn't until I I like met with the head of the family studies program at my university. She was super cool. She just didn't even bat an eye at it. She's like, absolutely, let's get you into being a sex therapist. Declare this major, declare your major as family studies, and then you'll have minors in sociology, psychology, and women's studies. It's through that I just like got this awesome education, really great connections. And I also bridged that into working with Smitten Kitten, which I always call the sex therapy frontlines, because people are way more apt to want to buy a vibrator to solve their marital problems than to actually like look inward and communicate. So
yeah. And for those of you who aren't local and don't know about this really fabulous Minneapolis resource, Smitten Kitten is a sex toy and education shop.
absolutely. And it's the best. They're the best. And I did 5 years with them, part of my undergrad and most of my graduate program. So that's my like first Marvel movie, maybe even bridging into my second one.
I am always like so impressed by people that are like, when I was a teenager, I wanted to be this. And then I just like stuck with that until this. And like, it's still a really great fit. Cause like, I think Laura and I have kind of done our origin stories, but like, I like just straight up was like, I don't know, let me try. Like, I like failed at a lot of other things. So then I was like, let me try this. Yeah. I saw a TV show and was like, I could do that. Like, that was like literally, it was super impulsive and it happened to work out. And so it's always like really fascinating for me to like hear people's stories where it's like, I knew it. And then I built, like, it's so responsible. And I don't feel like that was how I came into it.
I will say it's one of those things that I look back on, and even as I was going through like my education, I was really grateful for having this North Star of I want to do this and I know I want to do this. Because for me, I needed the tenacity to be like, no, I really want this and I'm going to do it. Otherwise, who knows? I don't know.
Mm. So. I think it's incredible that 17-year-old you could think about being a sex therapist. Like if you went back to 17-year-old me and said, guess what? You turn out to be a sex therapist. 17-year-old me would be like, what? What does that mean? I mean,
yeah, I would have no idea what that even was.
So
yeah.
we have to thank Barbara Streisand in Meet the Fockers.
That's perfect.
I wanted to be Barbara Streisand, you know, like that was it.
Yeah, I forgot about that role. You're younger than me, right? Like, so I would have been a little older. I would, to agree with you, Laura, I would have had like no idea. I would have been like,
Yep.
Sounds kinky. I don't know what that is. Like that's like, do you know what I mean? Like I never would have. Also, I was living in like small town Kansas, so I don't know how that would have gone over. But it's funny, as you were talking, like I've never seen the show Sex Education, but isn't it like a teen boy who's like like everyone goes to for like sex advice because his mom's like a sex, like there's a little bit of that vibe to what you're describing.
100%. And as I was watching that show, I was like tragically similar to my life. It's like, great. What? Amazing.
That's awesome. Calvin, I know you teach, you mentioned, right, that you teach graduate courses, and I teach a graduate course at the University of St. Thomas, right? And I'm just always curious, like, because I think teaching graduate courses in sex therapy is so fun. Like, it's like my favorite thing. And I was just curious, just because you do it too, you know?
Well,
Laura, you've taught grad courses too, right?
Yeah. I run a program, like a certificate course, and I think everyone there is graduate level students. Yeah.
And Laura and I co-taught 1 year at Argosy.
Did. And did we co-teach at St. Mary's? I can't remember now.
We did not. We were
going to.
And then
I remember now.
Shenanigans occurred. And that's how
things happened.
Yeah.
That's right. But that was good. That was a good handoff. But yeah.
It was rad. So St. Thomas is my alma mater. So I always a Tommy, and very grateful that they hired you on to teach that course. I think teaching at the graduate level is such an interesting task, and especially around this subject matter. Because when you're when you're teaching people about sex therapy, you're doing a lot of just basic sex ed first, and getting people used to the idea of what may walk into their office or what will theoretically eventually walk into their office. And so it's such a unique challenge that I've taught some just like foundations to marriage and family therapy classes too. And those classes did not have the same fun challenge of you're going to have half of the class knowing all of the stuff you're going to teach, and you have to keep them engaged. And you have half of the class that has never, ever engaged with any of this, and you have to keep them engaged. And you have to be fun and inviting to the field for your whole class.
All while navigating very complex reactions and feelings around cultural and religious values around sex that are like actively coming into the room as people ask their questions and the way that they ask their questions, and then navigating when one student maybe makes another student uncomfortable with their question and sort of the direction of their question. I don't know. I mean, you two are nodding, so I'm assuming, right? Like, I feel like you can't teach a course on sex, like sex and therapy, without also talking about like sex and culture, sex and religion at the exact same time. And it has to be like a part of those dialogues, which as a professor is it's a very challenging task, but I think it's so rich, because like one of the things I talk to my graduate students about is like, if you can't talk about it with each other, like, and having opposing values with each other, like we have to create a space of discourse in here, because that's exactly what you will be doing, which is like, oh, you hold different values than me as a clinician. Like, how do we, you know what I mean? Like, so it's so much like, even though it's like not a clinical setting, there's so much like rich, I don't know, that's sort of my way of thinking about it, like so much rich clinical learning that happens.
I 100% agree. I think that there's just there's so much that you can get into. And my semester is 16 weeks long, and that can feel like a real drag. But at the end of the semester, I always kind of look back and like, there's so much I wasn't able to touch on, because I'm covering so much just to bring people up to speed. And a lot of that is, how do we embrace like pleasure and sexuality in a culture that says that you shouldn't be doing those things, but also that you should be doing those things, right? I think our culture is one of commodified pleasure, that pleasure through capitalism is okay as long as you are creating more people. But the idea of pleasure for pleasure's sake and pleasure outside of capitalism becomes really threatening for a lot of people.
And
Well said.
Yeah, I think trying to navigate that along with conversations of like sex and like the personal, like how can you be like pleasure, or let's talk about pleasure and like all of the like not just the dangers but like the joys and the pleasures of sex, while also like allowing your own personal values to have importance and meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like whether those are cultural values, religious values, right? Like I think it's a really tricky dance, but I also think it's like, this is just my like opinion, but I like what's so important. Like, and I feel like I don't ever get to like watch that play out in the same way as I do in graduate courses where I have like a group of people trying to have these conversations, and it comes up just in the questions that people ask, right? Because people reveal a lot sometimes in the questions they ask and the way that they ask their question. And so yeah, anyway, sorry, I not to take us off on a tangent, but I think
I think
fascinating.
And I kind of want to just jump on I have two things I wanted to say on that. One, like this, I have a story of, I think my second term after my second class, I had one student, we were teaching via Zoom at the time, and I had one student stay behind like on the Zoom call. And I was like, hey man, what's up? He's like, this is just a lot. And I was like, yeah. He's like, it's a lot, man. And I was like, totally. I really appreciate you letting me know that. Like, I think it's going to be a lot this semester, but let's talk about it. Let's keep me in the loop because I want you to feel welcomed into these conversations instead of pushed away, because this student wanted to be a therapist, like a more religious leaning therapist. And I was like, buddy, you're going to be working with sex a lot. And if you can do that within that community and you can do that competently, that's going to be a huge gift to your community. And I'm hoping he really took that on. Mm-hmm. Then the other one is with teaching, I feel like you can have all the best intentions to have a specific game plan on what you want to teach your students. And then it's going to be like the one like off remark you make that is going to be the thing that they're going to clock onto and just glom onto.
Are we going to talk about it? Are we going to talk about the?
Absolutely.
Because I think I know what you might be talking about.
There's a notorious class where Laura and I were co-teaching, and we were showing videos on kink and
trying to really normalize BDSM, like get people comfortable with it, even if they've never had any exposure to it, and kind of let people know like this is a community with community standards and best practices. And yeah.
And it was a video from, I think, kink.com or something like that, where it was an interview before like a scene, right? And one of the people interviewed referenced blood play, and oh my God, did the students just glom onto blood play as like...
That was the end.
It was the end. It was the total end. And there was no way, I think, for us to really know that it was going to have such an impact. However, I think it really highlighted to me how our words hold so much value, or, the things we show hold so much value in a way that we're often not aware of. And I think that is something that transfers into being a therapist too. Like just an off remark or a tone that may be misread or what have you can really mean a lot to our clients in a way that we don't necessarily intend it, and don't always get the reflection back of, I really glommed onto that one thing you said, versus it's like, well, I said a lot of other things that were designed to be more impactful, but sure, glom onto that one.
Yeah, it was really clear like how much it really struck people, and I think a lot of people were going through their own emotions, like imagining. And when you just get one sentence, if somebody just drops the phrase blood play in when they're talking about all this other stuff that I feel like was really like great 101 information, like really empowering, I think people's imaginations got going too, and they were like, well, what is this? What do we even do with this? And I think it shows what a great example of like what a what a tinderbox these topics can be sometimes, and how they bring up big feelings for people. And that's absolutely okay. And that's what, especially a graduate level class or any kind of class, that's what it's there for. But
Absolutely.
yeah, it was kind of, we do still joke about blood play a little bit because it just derailed everything that we were trying to talk about. Yeah.
Well, and I feel like I don't want to assume for the two of you, but I feel like it's really easy, both as clinicians, educators, like you talk about sex, and I always like warn people in their intake with me. Like I feel like I give people a lot of like informed consent, like warning about me, where I'm like, I talk about sex all day, every day. I don't have a filter left. And in certain ways, I'm habituated to certain things, right? So I'm habituated, like to your point, right? Like I might casually be like, oh yeah, sexual strangulation, blah, 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 and like somebody
rock and roll, let's go.
Yeah, like, and I'm just sort of like moving on, right? And the person in front of me is like, and I do that now really consciously, like tell people like, if I say something or something that grabs you and you're like, what are you talking about? Or it's like, whoa, like I recognize that might happen, because to your point, like I think we become habituated just in talking about it every day, and probably especially, I just know the two of you and kind of the work that you do, the expansive degree. If you do especially a really expansive degree of sexual health work, you're just going to get used to talking about like a lot of stuff. And so there are always these like, now there's some ones that I can predict, like when I teach graduate courses, like I predict like, I've worked with like pedophilia, right? Like sexual attraction to minor, like to prepubescent children, right? I know that every semester I'm ready for that, right? Like I don't bring that up nonchalantly. I don't know that I ever did, but like there's certain topics that I know will be like, I'm going to say this and we're probably going to spend an hour on it. And I know that, and that's okay. I've built that now into my lesson plan. But then there are some things that like I bring sexual strangulation up because that was one, right? I was like, I have people read journal articles and I'm like, oh, there's a rise in sexual strangulation among youth. Let's read a journal article about it, everyone. And I'm like, how fascinating. And everyone, like, like half the class is like, oh yeah, how fascinating. The other half is like, what is this? And I totally didn't like level set, right, at all, because of my own habituation to it. Anyway,
That's so real though. And I think that when you are just like talking about this stuff all the time, it permeates your life. You talk about it because it doesn't have to be a big deal, right? And I do think that there's an intervention there with clients that I've really embraced in my practice, which is just how radical normalizing things can be, and even using some of the humor of like, this goober just talks about it all the time. I was pointing at myself, but like I talk about it all the time. I have an ongoing joke with one of my clients after they had a particularly like fisty session with somebody. I'm like, oh, you're the fist king of South Minneapolis. And they're like, hell yeah, because they've never been able to hold on to that type of like sexual pride and like have fun with it. And I think that there is something there too, like if we can turn towards the stigma and just say that's not that big of a deal. I think, of course there's certain subjects that are a big deal and we can acknowledge that too, but I feel like with sex we kind of run into the Jaws scenario where the movie Jaws is so much more scary when you can't see the shark, but when you see the shark, the shark looks kind of silly, right?
Kind of goofy.
Yeah. And that's an Andy Coleman comparison. My friend Andy has been saying that forever, and so I want to give him credit for it. But I think sexual stigma is like the movie Jaws. When we can't see it, when it's below the water, there's so much suspense, there's so much scary shit. But when you see it, there's often a little bit of humor to it.
Well, and when someone else is in the room with you and can get a little bit of that humor going, right? Which is always delicate because you don't want to make a joke at the wrong time. But I think there's something that like scares the shark away a little bit when you have another human with you that's like, yeah, we can talk about that. Like, that's not a big scary topic, or that, we can talk about that as if it's a everyday thing, because maybe it is, or even if it isn't, we don't have to make it into some big thing. Like the power of having someone do that with you and confirm with you of like, this is one way that we can address it, I think is something that a lot of people don't get. We need more of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think too, like the idea of like the importance of modeling, right? Like being able to just model sort of casual dialogue about sex, right? Like, so if,
Yep.
like, I'm nervous, like I would be nervous if I was sitting in an office with someone that also seemed nervous talking about what I'm talking about, right? Like,
Yes.
when someone
Yes.
like I think just psychologically, right, if the like, I mean, this is just like the basics of modeling, right, in psychology as well, right? Like when you see somebody, anxiety breeds anxiety, right? And in certain ways comfort breeds comfort, not always, but sometimes, right? It has the power to do that. And like, you know, if you're like, oh, you're the fist king of Denver, right? Like, what, I mean, there's a lot of fist kings, who knows, but
the fist
like
royalty of the United States.
there's a lot of, that should be like its own pageant, by the way. Like,
I would get into that kind of royalty. I'm not much of a royals person in my own life. I don't really follow the gossip, but I would maybe follow the gossip of fisting royalty.
Honestly, I think that does exist, and follow.
Yeah, good point.
Most things do. Most things, especially
I
if you
can't
take
get it in a magazine at Walgreens, though.
But that's the world I want, right? Where the IML royalty is featured prominently at the Walgreens checkout counter.
We can work towards it.
Uh-huh.
We can work towards it.
Should we take a break? And as much as I want to keep talking about fist kings of various cities and nations, should we take a quick break? And then I think there was some like kind of pro tips that Calvin wanted to share, which we always love.
Yeah.
So let's take a break and we'll be right back. And we are back. We learned on break that Laura made her own sun tea, which I was very impressed by. Laura, will you
I've been mad at myself, though, because I'm growing mint and I haven't put my mint in it. And we're already, halfway through the growing season.
How dare
you? What am
you?
I thinking?
How dare you?
I've failed.
What you have like done so many more like crafty things, like probably just this week than
I made an herb spiral. I mostly made an herb spiral with bricks, and then you plant. It's like a permaculture technique, and like the herbs that need the least amount of water and the most amount of heat go at the top, and then the ones that need shade and water go at the bottom. We'll see.
Herb Spiral sounds like my 90s band that never existed. Like, they play songs not unlike Candlebox.
This is beautiful. I will buy their reunion album. Well, I think we were talking about, Calvin, you had this great idea of like, there's some tips that kind of just are helpful for everybody. Like what the kind of thing that if you met a sex therapist at a party, like maybe you'd hope that they would like share this knowledge with you. And now you don't even have to go to parties. You can just listen to this podcast.
Thank God, honestly, because my party going days are over. But yeah, no, I think, and this is an invitation, I think, for the two of you as well, of course, because I think that we all have our go-to pro tips. When I was texting Laura about potential things to talk about in this episode, I said basic sex therapy tips, but it came out as based sex therapy tips, and I was like, hell yeah, let's do that, but more basic. But I'm thinking about, there's a few things that I think we kind of just do in every session with every client. And of course, every client has their own unique stuff. We don't want to universalize every intervention for every client, yada, yada, yada. And also, I think about how important permission is. And we were talking about modeling before the break. We were talking about normalizing, and all of that, I think, stems into permission. And I think the thing that I keep coming back to in my class when I'm teaching my students is, and at this point, I'm sure they're so sick of me about this, but I keep talking about the PLISSIT model, which is permission, limited information, specific suggestion, intensive therapy or treatment. The PLISSIT model is kind of a guideline for working with sexual shenanigans. And permission being the first part of the implicit model is so big because so many of us, I think, need to get the permission externally from someone else to say, like, it's okay that you like that. I was thinking about this the other day. I'm reading Tina Horn's book, Why Are People Into That? And the podcast is great. Not that we're, shilling other podcasts, but Tina Horn's podcast is fabulous. And
It's good to give shout out and credit where credit is due.
100%. And their book, which is the extension of the podcast, is fabulous because it's just all about various like things that someone could be into, right? And I just started the feet chapter, which is really great because every chapter starts out with like its focus, but then I think kind of expands into more cultural conversations around things we could consider. So I'm on the feet chapter, which is the first chapter. I'm kind of like hopping around, and I was reading the fisting chapter because I guess the theme today is fisting. And it was really cool because I think so much of that chapter was like, here's why people might be into this. Here's how it could be a radical act. But then here's how we can conceptualize penetration and encapsulation instead of penetration. The idea of someone receiving pleasure can hold a lot of power. Yada, yada. I'm kind of going off.
Wait, will you say that again? Because you just went through that pretty quick. And actually, I think that's kind of a mind-bending thing for people. People might need another second to pick up on that one. Will you say encapsulation again?
Look at me just going into the pro tips without even thinking I was going into the pro tips. So I think that Tina says circulation, not circulation. She uses a different term, but I usually use encapsulation versus penetration. And the idea here is that our words really matter and language matters. And penetration has a lot of connotations to it within our culture. The idea of being a receptive partner to penetration can carry some stuff. And sometimes that stuff can be really yummy and fun for folks, and sometimes maybe not. And so having other language that maybe is more empowering to a receptive partner can be a radical notion, right? The idea, and this is where we can kind of bridge into the pro tip, right? No matter what you're doing in a sexual scenario, you hold power, right? As long as it's consensual sex that everyone's like opting into, you are holding some level of power and you can feel empowered in that. And if you want to play with feeling like you have less power, that's totally cool, but you're consenting to that versus the idea of one person holding all this power and this other person maybe not. So yeah, my whole side quest there to kind of bring it back to, right, the permission piece and how we need to have more conversations that maybe deviate away from the Sex in the City type of permission of, look at this thing. Did you know that existed? Maybe it doesn't, whatever, to more of a, actually that does exist. And it's okay if you're into that, which I think that we could be doing better as a culture, and largely are doing better than we were in the late 90s, early aughts with Sex in the City. No shade to Carrie and the girls.
So something that you said in there, like this is why I like sex therapists shoot the shit, to engage in all aspects of sex nerdery here, right? Like something that I think is an interesting conversation, at least I think it's interesting, right, to talk with people about, or even just to think about, that letting go of control isn't the same as letting go of power. And those are two different things, and that you can separate those, right? Like when I think of letting go of control, right, there can be something very powerful in the act of letting go because there's a choice, right? Like you're choosing to let go of control. You are driving that ship, you're driving that choice, you're driving that decision, right? And so sometimes I think we like kind of use those things synonymously as though they're the same thing. But control and power, they certainly intersect, but that they're actually different constructs to me in certain
Absolutely.
ways.
Absolutely.
Anyway, just a nerdy thing you made me think of.
I love it. And like it's so true. And that delineation I think is really important, right? Because I'm going to bring it to the next thing that I like to bring up with people, which is the idea of sexual self-esteem and what makes us feel empowered in our sexual identity, within our relationship to sex and sexuality. I always tell folks that, everybody has a relationship with their sexuality and sex as a concept. And the idea of embracing the things that make you feel really confident and feel really good as a person is really important.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking about permission giving, because a lot of times people don't give themselves permission. A lot of times people don't give themselves permission to think about, the concept of sexual self-esteem, or like, what if I could be kind to myself around sexuality, or what if I could value my sexual self, or even the permission to think about penetration as engulfment.
Mhm.
I think that kind of stuff is, I see that happen with people in session, where even just the act of saying to someone, well, if you wanted to, you could pick a different name for this, if that made you feel better, if that reflected your experience more. Or, if you wanted to, you could focus in on your sexual self-esteem and give that some attention and support yourself in that. And that doesn't mean you're being selfish or bad. It's amazing how far permission giving can take people, and how much they need that, like, permission from someone else, maybe at first, until you get in the groove of giving yourself permission. Then you're like, oh wait, why do I need anybody else's permission? But I think it can be really helpful at first.
I also think that, sorry, this is me as a psychologist. I'm like, like, I think that when you're it could be about sex, it could be a lot of things. Like if we talk about permission giving, when you give, this is a clinical opinion, right? But I guess it's sort of theoretical, but I think sometimes when us as clinicians and as outsiders give people permission for things, like sometimes it's like, oh gosh, there's relief in that. I can have permission to do that. And sometimes there's dissonance, right? Where there's like, ooh, they're giving me permission, but I don't feel like I can take it, right? But in that dissonance is like that's where, oh, now we found it, right? Like that's what there is to work on, right? Like what is that barrier? What is that thing that's intruding on your capacity to take and to hold on to that permission? And so I think it also has a lot of like utilitarian sort of like there's a lot of utility in being able, even if someone's sitting in front of you and saying like, hey, like there's permission, take this permission, and someone's going, I want to, but I can't. Oh, that's really interesting. Now we see that dissonance, and now how do we use that to help you kind of identify what those barriers are? And so like I think permission giving, even when it's not sort of, because I say that because I think sometimes people carry shame over being like, I know I'm supposed to be sexually empowered. I know I'm supposed to feel good and know what I want and know how I want it. And now I feel extra bad because I know I should and I can't. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I think also being able to like be like, yeah, like some people are going to have a lot of like dissonance or essentially internal conflict, right, in that space. And a lot of times in therapy, that is what people are working through, is that conflict between knowing like I should be able to take something and I can't, right? Or I should be able to give and I can't, or I want to be able, maybe more I want to be able to and I can't. And like, then also feeling bad that they can't. I don't know if that makes sense, but
well, it's such an important distinction too, of like I should versus I want to, and even like kind of unfolding some of that too, right? What is saying that you should be X, Y, or Z way, and being able to really look at the systems that are informing that. Because, I think to that point, sex positivity can even perpetuate some bullshit around how you're supposed to be. This was, like it can create some really big internal and external conflict when we're perpetuating this idea that everyone's out here having all this crazy cool sex and that you should be down with all of it, when maybe you're not, and that's okay too. Or maybe there are challenges there, or maybe you are a fully fledged human being with a whole history that has brought you to this point, and some of that history is trauma or cultural baggage, or maybe something just kind of squeaks you out. That's okay too. Again, you don't have to be into blood play,
or fisting.
You don't have to.
Unless, well, if you want to be
Or
physical
vanilla sex.
royalty.
Yeah, you don't have to be into sex, really. You know, you could have a great sexual self-esteem that involved you being like, I'm not really into sex. It's not my thing. And actually, I feel pretty great about that. I feel glad that I know that. I feel like I can have conversation. You know, if I want to have partners, I can have conversations with them about it and feel good about it. I know other ways in my life that I feel good in my body and get joy. All of that could be part of your sexual self-esteem, and maybe you decide to be celibate your whole life. Maybe you identify as asexual. Maybe maybe you do have sex sometimes, but you just aren't, you're leaning into the idea of, I don't want to all the time. I don't want to frequently.
Well, I
Yeah.
think, yeah, absolutely. And I think and that kind of like bridges into this idea too of like, maybe you're really wanting to have sex that can't physically happen, right? And that you can have a relationship with fantasy that bridges into that, and that can build your sexual self-esteem or not, right? Like there's some stuff to consider there too. I was talking about this regarding like, you know, fantasy sex toys, right? Like there's all these cool like dragon dildos and stuff out there, but dragons don't exist, and you know, it's complicated because I don't know the intellect of a dragon, but you know, and their ability to consent, but they don't exist, and that's we don't have to jump through those hoops to consider those things, but we can still lean into fantasy there, and that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody has to go be sexual with other people to explore that, you know, desire. They can explore that desire by themselves, physically, mentally, both, whatever.
So this is a total aside
Yeah,
based on dragon dildos. So I
sick.
am sorry, but it
Hell
feels
yeah.
important.
it.
It's probably not, but it feels important to me. Did either of you hear? I don't know if this is true or not, that Etsy is getting rid of like being able to make and
Yes.
sell sex toys. And I think of that because there's so many like, you know, individual craftsmen and people that make sex toys and sell them on Etsy.
Mhm.
And, you know, don't get me wrong, I've certainly done like Etsy sex toys where I'm like, oh, we maybe want to bring that one back into the shop a couple times from a safety perspective. Maybe that one's not ready for market. Okay. But I appreciate the enthusiasm. But like there's so many people that do really beautiful sort of craftsmanship on, by the way, to your point, Calvin, like very niche fantasy, you know, sometimes kink, sometimes not, but like very often like niche fantasy stuff. And that's like this whole realm of that I don't know. Do you two know more about that? I just sort of heard that. I didn't.
I do know about it. I know that Etsy was facing a lot of pressure from outside groups around this, and the outside groups, to my knowledge, were citing the, you know, consistent like pedophilia thing as like, this is promoting exploitation of minors, this is perpetuating sex trafficking, like the greatest hits of some of these
Right,
groups.
which we know, which, you know, I don't know the details of this, but in general, that's really not the case. Somebody selling their homemade dragon dildos on Etsy is not perpetuating child trafficking. Like that's not a direct line in general. Yeah,
Just
right.
perpetuating cool fantasies about dragons, and we love that.
Or
But
someone that makes beautiful leather. I mean, that's a place to get a lot
Yeah.
of leather
Yeah.
gear is Etsy, and like really beautifully made.
well, I
Yeah.
think that this is, I think I'm thinking of two things here, so hopefully I can remember to talk about both of them. I think one, this really speaks to the power of outside groups and how they affect culture. So specific, you know, political groups, religious groups, cultural groups will perpetuate, you know, pressures onto websites or businesses to stop supporting sexual in nature businesses. So we see this with the adult industry in general, right? Like there's a lot of like PayPal. You can't use PayPal as a way to buy sexual in nature objects or like porn. And if
I didn't know that.
PayPal finds out that you are selling sexual items or pornography, they have the right in their user agreement to pull all the money out of your bank account or out of your PayPal account. This is also something we see in like credit card processing companies and credit card companies in general, that there'll be outside groups that will put pressure onto the credit card companies, and those companies will maybe take that on and say, okay, well, if you're an adult business, we can't work with you. And so we see that with adult retail, porn, et cetera, et cetera. But I think like the Etsy story is really kind of an encapsulation of that. It's this site where you have a lot of DIY creators, community creators, helping connect people with, items that help establish their sexual self-esteem, their relationship with sex and sexuality. And we have groups saying that's not okay, and now Etsy's pulling away from it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
and it's hard because it's harder to get the large group of people who are willing to loudly fight for the dragon dildos, right? Yes, I get it. I will too. But I mean, it's risky for people. Even if people feel like, okay, I would feel okay with that, and I would feel, and people are going to make assumptions about my sexuality, maybe in some sort of way, but I feel okay loudly and proudly standing up and advocating for this. People have lost their job over that kind of stuff. Yeah. People who are in custody battles worry about what's going to come up in court when they want their time with their kids. Like that's a scary thing, because one group gets to be really loud and voice their opinions, and the other group is sometimes in danger for trying to stand up for their opinions.
Yeah, I think it's really tricky because like there's been a lot of sites that have, to your point, Calvin, like have, in my understanding, like that have sort of like, because of certain outside pressures, right, or certain just pressures in general around like sort of like censorship essentially, or other types of things, that have had to like really then that it's like this pendulum swing of right, there's very few sort of barriers, and now all of a sudden it's like, okay, and now you can't, like I remember when Tumblr
Mm-hmm.
right, did it, and then all of a sudden people couldn't get access to really useful things on Tumblr, right, like, or like access to like learning or under, you know what I mean? And so like I think part of the thing that like I guess as an outsider, that's not working in these, and I'm sure it's very complicated, right, but that I struggle with is that like rather than like everyone sometimes, and maybe it's happening behind the scenes and I just don't know about it, but like slowing down and being like, okay, like a lot of the concern is often about youth and youth access, right? Yeah. And is like, okay, like, are there other answers than just shut it all down, shut everything down? Like, could there be more nuanced ways to try to protect people that, are under 18 or that like maybe can't consent in certain ways, you know what I mean? Like, are there, if those are chief concerns? And so I feel like and this is maybe a greater cultural struggle we have, there's sometimes a lot of all or nothing sort of behaviors around some of these things, which gets very challenging for them, because we're not engaging in like thoughtful dialogue about it.
I think I always think of the Simpsons when I think the Reverend Lovejoy's wife just goes, well, somebody think of the children, right? Like, I feel like that is just the thing that is off-cited. And, at the end of the day, we're in such a radical place with the internet being what the internet is, and everybody having a supercomputer in their pocket at any given point, that like, your children are finding it no matter what. Your children are more capable of utilizing the internet than you are. So this is a great opportunity to not lean into George Bush era abstinence only education and start having conversations with your kids, which is another basic sex therapy pro tip. Have open dialogue with those around you around sex and sexuality. If you have concerns about your kids and their relationship with porn or their relationship with sexuality as it's growing, it's really important to talk about those things and talk about ethical consumption and talk about the legality of these types of around porn or around whatever.
And the irony is that education, as we probably all know and are aware of, tends to keep people safer.
Yes.
not encourage more risk-taking behavior. And that's the unfortunate misunderstanding.
That's
of
right.
it all.
Well, and I mean, think about what it's like when you might be a young person who feels like they can take their questions to a trusted adult, or you do run across something on Etsy and you're like, I don't know what this is. What is it? And you can ask a trusted adult instead of maybe Googling more, or, you know, I mean, so much of it is when we have this silence, young people have no place to go to get personalized education, to ask the question or to be like, I found this and I feel some sort of way about it. Can we talk about it? And again, like jumping back to that feeling of like, you don't want to go to a sex therapist that's going to look freaked out when you tell them whatever you need to tell them. Your kids aren't going to want to talk to you about sex if you freak out every time. Or if you tell them, where did you find that information? You shouldn't be asking that question. And I get it as a parent. The things that we're told to us sometimes come out of our mouth and we just do it, or we panic and we, in that moment, kind of shut the conversation down, or we feel more awkward than we hoped we would. But you can always have a follow-up conversation. You can always go back to them and be like, hey, honey, I freaked out a little bit there. Whoops, sorry. Like, I've had a little bit more time to think about it. And here's what I really want you to know. And thank you for coming to me with that question. And, you know, you can always come to me with that question, or let them know what trusted adults in their life they can go to get their questions answered. Because, you know, some kids just are not going to talk to their parents about sex. But if they know that Auntie so-and-so is a safe person and is going to give you real information, then they've got somebody there.
Mm-hmm. As much as I feel like we could all keep going on this for a million, just because we can never help ourselves. We always end up
nope. We always end up on sex education.
We always do. But it's so multifaceted. Any final, because I know we're about out of time, any final pro tips, Calvin, that you'd like to throw out?
Goodness.
Sorry I diverted us with Etsy, but I was like, dragon dildos, Etsy.
No, it's important to talk about.
And I do want to just bridge back to my second point that before I go into my pro tips, I know we're low on time here. My second point being community spaces. Community spaces are so important. And Etsy, I think, allowed community to form outside of being centralized in cities. You had people from all over who had access to things. I think that's a really important thing, because when you're talking about being brave around your sexuality, owning your sexuality, exploring who you are, there is a level of DIY that has to occur. There's like DIY community that you connect with. And so it's a bummer that Etsy is choosing to make this decision, and I hope that they decide to go the other way with it. All right, pro tips. So permission. Laura, you said something that really struck me, which is the idea of apologizing when we have a reaction and coming back to that conversation. I think you can have that, like, you can universalize that amongst all different types of relationships. This is something that I work with a lot of my couples around. Like, how do you apologize for a reaction or own your reaction, but come back to it and say, hey, I had a reaction. Maybe cause some feelings. Let's talk about that. And let's maybe explore ways we can do this sustainably for both of us, or all three of us, or all four of us, or whomever's involved. I think acknowledging how important the brain is to sex and decentralizing genitals, of course, right? Genitals are super cool and they do amazing things. But when we, again, perpetuate capitalism and a production mindset around orgasm, we kind of lose the fun of it. And so if we can lean into fun, exploration, taking in all different types of sensation, I think we're more likely to have a better experience, whether there's an orgasm or not. Those are some of my greatest hits. That and breathing. Make sure you're breathing. People really have a hard time with breathing, especially folks with penises. I just know that so many people with penises grow up masturbating and trying to be really, really quiet about it. And so they start holding their breath. That leads to this whole thing where they're not breathing while they're having sex. Then they're like, why can't I feel anything? You have to oxygenate your blood to have, it's a whole thing. So a lot of breathing. Make sure you're breathing. Make noises. It's okay. Play music in the background if you feel embarrassed.
I love it.
I love breathing.
That's a great tip.
Breathing, like
that can really unite us at the end of this episode.
I
if
love
we've talked
breathing.
about anything and you were like, I don't know, that might be a step too far for me. We can all agree we love breathing.
There's going to be at least 2 people on the internet that are like, not me, and how dare you?
I mean, to be fair, we already talked about the erotic strangulation earlier, so.
It's true.
We've already crossed many lines.
That's the embrace of not breathing to then breathe. So,
Yeah.
I love when we have you on, Calvin, because we talk about all the things, and I think to myself, okay, how am I going to cut this down for social media? But I love that.
You just cut down the clip. You just cut down the clip of Calvin saying genitals are fun. That's all.
I mean, that is the takeaway message. One of the key takeaway messages. Yeah. Hey, if you loved this interview with Calvin, which I bet you did, you can go back to episode 3 of our podcast, the very first time we sat down with Calvin.
Audio only, sadly.
Audio only, but still great. Still great. And you can anticipate episodes, many more episodes with Calvin as a guest, I'm sure, because Calvin, you're wonderful. Thank you for being on the show. It's always wonderful to shoot the shit with you.
I love shooting the shit. It's one of my favorite things.
One day we'll just do like a 3-hour, everyone has a lot of hydration and snacks, and we just
go.
Okay, so we're all gonna go out to New York. We'll hang out. There'll be coffee hour.
We'll do a live recording. Let's do
this.
I love this idea.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do it.
I'm in.
Yeah.
This is great. Well, Calvin, until our live New York episode, where can people find you and your work?
Well, you can Google me. It's Calvin Hauer, Hauer. And my professional website's really bare bones. My Psychology Today is pretty meh. It's really there to assist folks to get to know me at a baseline to then schedule with me. You can see me speaking around the Twin Cities. I'm going to be doing a talk with Laura at the MAMFT Conference, which I'm the co-chair of. And if you're local to Minnesota, please come to the MAMFT Conference. It's going to be such a blast. The theme is the joy of connection, and we're bridging generations and different types of healers with marriage and family therapists. So it's going to be a blast and a half, which is not something I would usually say about a professional conference.
We'll make sure to put the link to that conference and to your website in wherever we're putting links. Descriptions? Probably descriptions. I don't know.
Hole. We just throw it in there.
Look around. It's attached to this episode somehow.
We love that. All right. Yeah. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, this is the part where I have to fidget and touch my hair and do all kinds of weird things so that hopefully I won't do it.
My bad.
Liquid death.
While we're meeting.
What is your beverage, Laura?
It's sun tea that I made myself in a jam jar.
Did you set it outside?
I did. I have
set a big jar? Was it a big jar?
Yeah, it's my summer tea making jar. Like my grandma did.
Yeah, I used to do that all the time when I was younger. I don't think I've made sun tea in years, decades.
You've got a fire escape. Get to it.
This is your call to action.
You assume that there's not a giant brick wall that prohibits the sun.
Oh.
This is New York City.
That's sad. Sorry.
No, it's all right. Anywho, Shall we come back from this break?
Let's come back and be semi-professionals. We don't have to.
Sweet.